that people can hear me. So I'm going to say a couple of words. We're just about to show in a second a very short welcoming video with regards to the updated guidelines. And we'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar today. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion ahead. There is, to all of the attendees who are on the line, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which you can click and you can ask questions throughout the webinar. And then at the end of the webinar, we will have a dedicated space for answering those questions that you put forward to the panelists as we go. But for now, let me turn to my colleague and see whether we can play our short welcoming video. Thank you. Great, many thanks and welcome again to everybody. Like I said at the start, we're delighted to have you and very much looking forward to the panelists that we have in place for today's discussion. As you saw in the short film that we just presented, the guidelines are a set of recommendations by government to business, and they're based on the premise that responsible business conduct is a precondition for a sustainable future. The guidelines and their government-backed recommendations are embedded in business practice and public policy from across the world. They underpin the important work of trade unions and civil society, representing millions of people across global supply chains. They are, in short, part of the global code for a rules-based trade and investment system. Earlier this year, on the 8th of June, the OECD released its most recent update of the guidelines, and this is the first update since 2011. With this update, governments have renewed their commitment to responsible business conduct with recommendations that are now fit for addressing the sustainability challenges of our time. So in this webinar together, we will be doing a few things. We will unbox the guidelines to share with you what's new and what's changed and why it matters. We will then hear reactions from business, from trade unions, from civil society, and also from the policymakers, all of whom were around the table during the update of the guidelines. And we will be focusing in on what happens next, the implementation of the guidelines and this important instrument. And lastly, of course, we want to hear from all of you, the audience who are with us. So do, as I mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go in the box that's available. Great, so then without further ado, let me share my screen and begin the unboxing of the guidelines and talk you through what has changed in this most recent update. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the guidelines consist of 11 chapters and a set of procedures which speak to NCP's national contact points for responsible business conduct with regards to their functions. Here are the 11 thematic chapters, and I will run through each of them in terms of the main changes that have occurred. But before that, I want to say a quick word about the preface. This is an important part of the guidelines that we don't very often talk about, and there have been a few changes that have occurred in this latest version of the guidelines. So firstly, the preface now recognises the international context that businesses operate in. It focuses and highlights this concept of risk-based due diligence, which now permeates throughout the guidelines. And it recognises the role of governments in creating an enabling environment for responsible business conduct and what that looks like through the smart mix of policy measures. Then we have chapters 1 and 2, concepts and principles, and general policies. Somewhat innocuous titles, but there's a lot in these opening chapters that's important, including things like, what factors do you consider when determining whether a multinational enterprise or another entity falls under the scope of the guidelines? We unpack this risk-based due diligence concept and deal with the 6-step framework in these chapters. We also talk about things like meaningful consultation, responsible engagement and disengagement is in there. And we define what we mean by business relationships. We don't use the terms upstream or downstream with regards to due diligence, but we do make it clear that what is meant by supply chain is broad and all-encompassing. There's also content in here with regards to reprisals and the importance of taking steps to prevent reprisals against people who may wish to bring complaints, and the importance of ensuring transparency and integrity in lobbying activities. Finally, there's some new content around aligning self-regulatory initiatives or multi-stakeholder initiatives with international standards, such as the guidelines. In chapter 3, we come on to the first thematic chapter, that's disclosure. And what's important to note here in terms of a headline is that this chapter now aligns with the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance. It includes things like beneficial ownership, board composition, materiality, etc. There's also content in there with regards to disclosing RBC information in line with the due diligence model, and noting that due diligence can support companies in identifying material risks and impacts. Finally, the guidelines recognize that RBC information may be considered material if its omission or misstatement could reasonably impact an investor's assessment. Moving on then to human rights. So of course, this chapter, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was added to the guidelines in 2011. So it's aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And as a result, we didn't need to change too much. However, there have been some additions. Notably, we have some new language in there now with regards at-risk individuals and groups, for instance, human rights defenders and indigenous peoples. The guidelines also note that other OECD due diligence guidance provides further information with regards FPIC, free, prior and informed consent. There's also some language in there with regards enhanced due diligence necessary in the context of armed conflict or gross human rights abuses. On employment, there's now recognition of the rights of all workers to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Previously, this was limited to those employed by the company. There's also new language with regards to the importance of providing a safe and healthy working environment. So this is to align with the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. And there's more information now with regards to human trafficking. Finally, in this chapter, you'll find some new language in terms of upskilling and reskilling and the importance of managing changes in light of automation and green transitions. Then we come on to the environment chapter. Now, this chapter, along with the science, technology, and innovation chapter, has seen the most changes. So much so that we're doing a webinar dedicated to this one and the tech chapter later in October, and there'll be more information about that soon. Not surprising that the environment chapter has seen a lot of changes because, of course, there have been so many developments at the international level in this space. And so there's quite a lot to unpack here. But the big headline, the main takeaway, is to note that the guidelines, as a result of changes in this chapter, now represent the first internationally agreed standard for how businesses should address climate change. So let's dig into a few of these then. So firstly, with regards impacts and due diligence in the environmental space, we've applied this due diligence lens to adverse environmental impacts. And now you will see a non-exhaustive list of possible environmental impacts that may be associated with business activities, including things like climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, etc. The guidelines apply cause, contribute, directly linked framework to environmental impacts and recognize the interlinkages between environmental impacts and human rights, such as health and safety, impacts to workers, communities, land rights, etc. They also underscore the importance of a just transition, using that term specifically. On climate change, like I said, the guidelines now emphasize that companies should ensure their greenhouse gas emissions and their impact on carbon sinks are consistent with internationally agreed global temperature goals based on best available science. They also encourage companies to introduce these science-based targets and review them regularly. And finally, in this section, it's noted that companies should avoid activities that undermine climate adaptation for and resilience of communities, workers, and ecosystems. The third main piece of the environment chapter relates to biodiversity. And here it notes that companies need to contribute to the conservation of biological diversity, avoiding and addressing land, marine, and freshwater degradation, including deforestation. There's language in there with regards to the circular economy, which is new. So in the context of provisions on sustainable consumption and production. And then finally, another new piece is animal welfare, noting now that companies should respect animal welfare standards aligned with the World Organization for Animal Health. On corruption, the headline here is that the chapter now recognizes other forms of corruption beyond bribery. So here we're talking about trading in influence, embezzlement, etc., etc. It recognizes that adverse impacts on matters covered by the guidelines are often enabled by means of corruption. And it encourages collective action and meaningful engagement with local and international civil society organizations. Not much to highlight with regards to consumer interests. It's a chapter, just a couple of things. Firstly, that the chapter now underscores the potential risks of the e-commerce market, and notes that any sustainability related product claims need to be based on adequate evidence and tests, etc. Then we come on to science, technology, and innovation. And as I mentioned, this chapter has seen a number of changes. Previously, it was really more about technological transfer and the benefits of this sector in the wider society. So what's changed? Well, firstly, and most importantly, it's now established that companies need to conduct risk-based due diligence on impacts relating to science, technology, and innovation. So here we're looking at development, financing, sale, licensing, use of technology. This is quite important because in 2011, there was a deliberate carve-out of this chapter, the competition chapter, and the taxation chapter from the due diligence provisions. The chapter also encourages the adoption of responsible data governance, recognizing the importance of protecting privacy. It notes a few high-risk contexts and what to do, and it recognizes the importance of digital security risk management. With regards to competition, a couple of changes here. Firstly, noting that RBC initiatives are not inherently in conflict with competition law, and that companies might be subject to competition law when buying labour input. And then finally, with regards to thematic chapters on taxation, one main update, which is that the chapter now highlights the provisions of the OECD BEPS projects, base erosion and profit shifting. So we have alignment there. So that's the chapters covered, bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I'm sure there's plenty for us to discuss in that regard. But let me say a quick word now about the changes to the procedures that relate to the role of the national contact points for responsible business conduct. So a few things have changed here. Firstly, we've adjusted the language and created new, what we call effectiveness criteria. And this is really the baseline for all NCPs globally in terms of what's expected across the board. We now have mandatory periodic peer reviews. These were previously voluntary, so now they've been moved into a different system. The initial assessment criteria has been tightened up, and notably there's new language in there with regards to coordination, which is an important part of the NCP role because it's rare these days that a case brought to an NCP will involve only one country. So that coordination aspect and that identification of the lead NCP is important. It's noted now that NCPs will always make a public statement and that recommendations and follow-up are now the norm. So post-agreement, follow-up should take place and recommendations ought to be made. Language has been clarified around what we mean by transparency and confidentiality in this context. And there's a provision in there now with regards to supporting policy coherence on RBC for NCPs to take on that role should they wish. And finally, and importantly, there's also now a recommendation in there that all NCPs take appropriate steps to address the risk of reprisals against anyone bringing forward a specific instance case. So that's it from me in terms of the unboxing of the guidelines and the procedures. I'd like now to hand to Alan to say a quick word about our new recommendation that speaks directly to governments.
Thank you, Catherine. And before I do so, I know it's a lot of content that has just been unboxed for you. And while there is no compare version between the new updated edition of the guidelines and the former one, we have on our website placed a summary, a PowerPoint deck, which chapter by chapter will walk you through the main changes. So a bit of a cheat sheet there. And I can see there are a number of questions to that effect in the Q&A. So as mentioned by Catherine, whereas of course the guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct are recommendations by governments to businesses, the OECD last year adopted a recommendation which speaks to the role of government in promoting responsible business conduct. And this recommendation is adopted by the same governments that are also adhering to the guidelines for multinational enterprises. And the recommendation makes across 6 main areas a number of recommendations to governments for what they can do through policies and other means to promote responsible business conduct implementation in the private sector and as well as in the public sector. And I will just highlight a main feature here, which talks about the recommendation that governments develop and enforce a legal and regulatory framework to enable responsible business conduct, and that when developing policies to that effect, governments are recommended that they should align those policies with, where relevant, with the guidelines for multinational enterprises and the associated due diligence guidance. So responsible business conduct at the OECD really walks on 2 legs, both the recommendations directly to business and also now this new recommendation, which is the public part of responsible business conduct. So with that said, I think we're ready to commence to our first panel today. As you will know, the process of updating the guidelines has involved close consultation with businesses, with trade unions, and with civil society. And indeed, the guidelines themselves are based on the premise that all stakeholders in society take part in their implementation. So we're now going to hear some really important reactions from key stakeholders who deal with responsible business conduct issues on a daily basis. So for this first round of our discussion, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Miguel Barbosa Lopez, who is South America researcher and representative with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Welcome, Miguel. We have also Ashwini Suktanka, who is from the AFL-CIO, so the trade union. Welcome, Ashwini. And last but not least, we have Laura Rubo, who is Director for Global Public Policy at Disney. Welcome, Laura, also to you. So we're really keen to hear from you, your first reactions, and of course also your more forward-looking thinking about the implementation of the updated guidelines. And perhaps I will start with you, Miguel, on that first question. What matters most to you about the updated guidelines, and why are those things important from your perspective as seen from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center? Over to you.
Thank you, Alan, Catherine, and all the OECD team for the organization and also for the incredible job in the publication of the updated guidelines. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center has actively participated in the public consultation convened by the OECD to update its guidelines. We really appreciate this open space. We emphasize that in 2010, 11 guidelines needed revision as they did not identify what measures companies should take to avoid violations to human rights defenders, as well as the need for the national contact points to have an adequate procedure to address this. On this subject, the guidelines have made great progress with their update. We welcome in particular 3 points. The first one, companies now must prevent any act against persons or groups of persons observing the company's activities. The second one defined retaliation and strategic lawsuits against public participation. And the third one calls for an active role of the national contact points to avoid threats to these groups. However, there are some crucial gaps that we can identify. The first one, the necessity to mention human rights defenders in the chapter of retaliation, on reprisals, sorry. The second one, the necessity to mention the Universal Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And the third one, to provide guidance to companies on the measures to be taken to promote a safe space for defenders. In Latin America, the situation of human rights defenders is quite special and worrisome. In our upcoming briefing focusing on Latin America, we revealed that between January 2015 and December 2022, the Resource Center identified nearly 2,000 attacks against defenders in Latin America and the Caribbean, representing the 42% of the total attacks worldwide. These include killings, judicial harassment, death threats, disappearances, and other forms of intimidation. In addition to this, we must consider the topics now indicated in the update guidelines of the OECD, such as corruption and technology, science and innovation, climate change, and policy coherence. From the center, we observe with concern the permanent actions of intimidation of human rights defenders who, through the use of technology, are treated and monitored, discouraging their right to participate and express themselves. Also, the phenomenon of corruption, especially in the investigation of legal cases followed by companies against defenders, where we have observed the delivery of bribes by businessmen to the public power, the permanent abuse by companies of indigenous territory, particularly Amazonian, for the exploitation of hydrocarbons. But how can the OECD most effectively help people affected by the impacts of companies located in OECD member states to obtain redress? This is through strengthening the national contact points. As detailed in the document entitled Briefing Paper Updated OECD Guidelines Give Civil Society More Grounds to Demand Corporate Accountability from June 2023, governments needs to improve the implementation of national contact points, which should not have so much flexibility in their regulation. Many people who are victims of corporate activities do not know that this mechanism exists and what it is for. In a workshop held a few days ago in Puno, Peru, with Aymara and Quechua peasant leaders, we identified that many of them doesn't have enough knowledge about how the national contact points works. So this is something that we were working, Alan, and what we need to say about this first question.
Thank you, Miguel, for also ending on the note of the importance of actually disseminating to target audiences. And we'll come back to more how you as the resource center and how you see your peers also moving forward in that area based on the updates. And you also, I think, naturally home in on some of the key updates around meaningful stakeholder engagement and protection of human rights defenders and the importance of having open, free, and meaningful participation as a basis for the whole system to work. So I'd like to turn to you, Ashwini, next from AFL-CIO's perspective. What are the most significant updates that you're seeing in this unboxing and why? Thank you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Catherine, for organizing this. I'd like to start by saying that that the labor movement's input on and investment in the OECD guidelines over time runs pretty deep. We'd been active in consultations even leading up to the 2011 guidelines, and we invested a great deal in trying to make those work. Just speaking for the US labor movement here, it wasn't just about investing in filing specific instances. It was also about investing in the reform of the US NCP 15 years ago to try to build in structural stakeholder accountability and a real voice for labor. Also in our work with global unions, global union federations, when we tried to secure global framework agreements, which are agreements signed between unions and global companies, we bargained routinely in the shadow of the guidelines. And the approach of human rights due diligence is reflected in many of those agreements. So that's to say there was real labor movement ownership of the 2011 guidelines, and we weren't quick by any means to declare any of those a failure. But certain dimensions were a failure, I have to say, and protections for organizing and collective bargaining rights really stand out. So those were among our key priorities, I would say, when it came to looking at Chapter 5 on employment and industrial relations. Over the 10 years since the 2011 guidelines, we felt that we'd been dealing in many ways with accelerated employer opposition to workers' organizing. And when we were trying to counter that, the human rights due diligence principle was really not enough to get us there. Just as an example, we saw anti-union consulting firms offering, human rights due diligence compliant union avoidance as one of their services. So we were clear that we needed explicit language related to non-interference with a worker's choice to form or join a union. And the second, as Catherine also mentioned, over more than a decade, the relationship between employers and employees had eroded further. We'd seen an expansion of subcontracting, of temp agencies, greater complexity of global supply chains, and the fact that the 2011 guidelines still limited the scope of responsibility to directly employed workers meant a limitation in their value. So those two changes were clearly critical for those of us who believe, as the labor movement does, that workers are central to implementation through the power of unions and through the expansion of collective bargaining. And by expanding the principle to millions of workers in triangular employment relationships and global value chains, it's really, we anticipate that being transformative. Obviously, there were other principles that we fought for and didn't necessarily get to where we needed to be. For example, we had really sought greater clarification of M&E duties to workers in the context of new technology, artificial intelligence, the intrusive and exploitative use of worker data. Shall I leave it there? I assume you want us to come back to the implementation issue later.
Indeed, Ashwini. That will be my second round, so I'll come back to you on that, if ever so shortly. So thank you for that, and you also touch upon the fact that sort of an undercurrent for the update of the guidelines really throughout was that obviously there is an increased complexity in supply chains that affects people in them, but also in other contexts. And you also talk about the fact that other thematic areas of the guidelines, such as transition to green technologies and the technological developments, are of course very material, also as seen from a labor perspective. So I'm going to move to our third panelist now, and I mentioned initially that of course the guidelines are on the premise of a collaboration with all stakeholders, but they are, Laura, recommendations to businesses. So of course businesses are a key stakeholder here, and also have a lot to do in terms of dealing with the complexity of the issues that we're seeing now reflected in the guidelines and also in many other global discussions. And I know you're used to looking at that from your chair at Disney, but also in a broader sense from international business perspective as a whole. So I look forward to hearing your take on what are the key updates or features of this update that are important to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And you touched upon it a bit. My day job is with the Walt Disney Company, but I wear another hat, which is working with business at OECD as the vice chair of the Investment and RBC Committee, and also work very closely with their U.S. constituent, the U.S. Council for International Business. So it's really in the business at OECD and USCIB context, and I'm speaking today kind of more generally on multinational enterprises. And you also said, Alan, that it's important that business is represented here. These guidelines are in fact directed at business. So business must in fact be part of the deliberation around not just the development of the guidelines, of course, which business at OECD was deeply involved in, but also in the implementation and the awareness raising. So there's a couple of points I want to make about the updated guidelines, and some of it is really about what's been preserved or emphasized from prior iteration. This update was originally characterized as a targeted update. It looks a little bit more like a very significant revision, and there's quite a bit more in this text now that companies are continuing to digest and to put into practice. So let me just talk about a few points that remained or that were emphasized that are really important to the business community. The first point is really about the voluntary nature of the guidelines. Multinational enterprises come in many shapes, sizes, and contexts. A large global financial services company is not the same as a small rubber plant that trades between two countries. And every company needs some flexibility to be able to consider their legal context and to adapt their business models, their operations, their services or products as appropriate to their specific reality. And this may mean that a company will move more swiftly or in a more targeted fashion with respect to certain elements of the M&E guidelines that are most relevant for them. So the voluntary nature of the guidelines and the preservation of that continues to be a really important element of this update. And this brings me to a second point, which remains important for the business community. And that's this idea about proportionality and prioritization. It is true that businesses cannot know everything everywhere all the time. We, nor anyone on this call, are omniscient. And so while multinational enterprises must, of course, undertake due diligence to understand where they may cause, contribute, or be linked through business relationships to adverse impacts, it must be recognized that M&Es may necessarily need to prioritize action in certain cases. It doesn't mean that the rest of the guidelines are ignored, but rather that there's a deliberate, stepwise approach to seeking their effective implementation. And so this idea of preserving the concept of proportionality and prioritization is important for the business community. The next point I'll make, and it's implicit in some of what I've just said, but it needs to be explicitly acknowledged and emphasized, reiterated, is that the concept first articulated in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights around causing, contributing, or being directly linked through business relationships to adverse impacts, that remains a central point of the updated M&E guidelines. There's a very significant difference in the amount of information and influence a multinational enterprise may have, depending upon where they fall on this continuum of impacts. And so the UNGPs clearly articulated this concept, and there is very wide acceptance and understanding of this idea in the business community. And we were pleased to see that this was reiterated and emphasized, maintained in this iteration of the guidelines. Maybe one final point I'll make just in terms of what's important. Business at OECD and its constituents continue to value the role of the NCP. We support the strengthening of the NCP, the peer review process. We, of course, understand that in order for the NCP process to work, that there must be agreement among the parties to accept the good offices of the NCPs. that there must be trust in the process and good faith engagement to work towards effective outcomes. And we would like to also emphasize that the NCPs also work in unique contexts. They have different legal frameworks, different kind of history and capacity and resources. And we do believe that flexibility should be maintained in how NCPs are established and operated. I'll just reiterate again, we do believe that the peer review process is really valuable, and we'll look forward to seeing how that continues to come to life in practice. So, Alan, those are just a few initial reflections about how business has perceived the update to the M&E guidelines.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that extremely clear and I think concise readout. And you make the point that many important things have not changed, and for good reason. And I think from the strong signal from business that the risk-based approach, that the focus on continued engagement and the clarity of the involvement framework, as it will, which we find in the guiding principles as well as in the OECD guidelines, that those are by now tried and tested concepts by business that we do need to preserve, and that has indeed been, I think, a calling card also for this update to maintain this alignment with those tried and tested concepts. We'll come back to the NCP points in our second panel with our government. I will give you just 1 or 2 minutes to come back to the point on how your region, your constituencies, seeing the implementation of these updates play out. I mean, what are you concretely envisaging doing with these new guidelines that you weren't already engaged in and doing? So maybe, Miguel, I can go back to you with that question. How are you going to move forward, leveraging the updates that we now have on the table from your chair? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I will try to be very concrete in 3 minutes, I think, or 2. From the Resource Center, we are committed to a work route that supports civil society organizations, particularly those human rights defenders who are victims of violations by companies. In line with the new update of the guidelines, we can provide support in the following areas. The first one, to continue documenting cases of violations against human rights defenders. This will make visible from an intersectional perspective the different vulnerabilities of the people affected, and will also establish the most common patterns that allowed such violations to be committed by 2 angles. The first one, the business sector involved, and the second one, the public policies or regulations that allowed them to be committed. The second point, this documentation can be support also the national contact points to better implement their mandate and gain a better understanding of the various issues that arise at the national level where they operate. If OECD decides to create guidance on human rights defenders and business, we will also be happy to provide advice on how best such guidance can complement and integrate existing and upcoming guidance on the issue issued by the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, etc. The third point, with the institutional strengthening of the national contact points, we can also strengthen the capacities of human rights defenders who wish to use this mechanism. We have a wide network of organizations that protect the right of human rights defenders with whom we can work. The fourth point, there is much ambivalence about access to information on corporate activities, particularly when a case is submitted to the courts or to an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, such as those established in the national contact points. In this field, the center could help to continue providing recommendations to break down this information barrier. This could be done through and in collaboration with the OECD Watch, an organization with which we have already worked and we have a very strong relationship. The fifth point, it's about the policy and regulation coherence in these cases. The updated guidelines mention that this is very, very important. In our monitoring work, we at the center have noticed this. It's therefore important to continue to be vigilant of the implementation of these guidelines by companies and also of the impetus that the states give to this issue. Coherence between the implementation of the guidelines and the upcoming mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation on the European Union level will be particularly important. And finally, to identify differentiated impacts on defenders within the dynamic of supply chain. It's important, especially for lead brands, to be aware of attacks on defenders that happen in lower tiers of their supply chains, over reliance on social audits and cascading contractual responsibilities can lead to blind spots. Lead brands needs to find a way to proactively monitor the situation through strengthening their approach to stakeholder engagement, including with defenders. And at the Resource Center, we have developed different research and guidance on this topic that we are very, very happy to share.
Thank you, Miguel. A number of important issues where I think you demonstrate well how the update can help you move the needle on those issues. Ashwini, I go to you next. What's your strategy for leveraging this update? You touched on it a little bit, and we have maybe a couple of minutes for you on that, if that's okay.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. So as we signaled before, Labor does see the workers' role as central to implementation of the guidelines, as well as for securing substantive rights that aren't adequately defined or protected in the guidelines even now. So given this, of course, we're disappointed that the updated procedures don't require that NCPs structurally include unions and civil society. I'm with Miguel on this one, that flexibility is a problem. Far less excited than Laura about that dimension. Too many NCPs have a lack of understanding of labor relations, even now, a lack of respect for unions. And in our experience, that's one of the main reasons that many specific instances related to freedom of association don't have successfully mediated outcomes. Building in the expertise and the perspective of workers and unions would have improved implementation, both of Chapter 5 and beyond. We will be looking to NCPs to make the updates to Chapter 5 a consistent dimension of their promotional work, especially to advise multinational enterprises that the playing field has changed. Regarding what respect for freedom of association means in particular, we'll be engaging multinational enterprises, both those that we have a relationship with and those that we don't yet have a relationship with. And we'll want to make sure that they understand that the standard anti-union practices that we see so frequently are clear violations of the updated guidelines. Stuff like captive audience meetings, the flyers that advise workers not to trust union organizers, the messages that workers don't need a union in the modern era. We see those as clear violations. I mean, then there's one more thing that I would add if I have a minute, which is that we will be conveying to governments the need to mainstream the guidelines and RBC principles across their functioning, the businesses that they contract with, the ones that benefit from export credits, the ones that are supported by businesses in other ways. Those relationships need to be conditioned on those businesses taking compliance and remedy under the guidelines seriously. Obviously, there's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Ashwini. And we have, I think, also experience on the next panel on some of those areas. Laura, I'll go to you last from the business at the OECD perspective. What are you going to do differently from now on in terms of implementation of the updated guidelines? What do you see coming up?
Yeah, so I think effective implementation necessarily flows from awareness and feasibility and practical implementation tools. So let me just start by saying business at OECD has been extremely active in the revision process from the very beginning. We've read numerous draft texts, and they've regularly engaged their member associations to inform them about the update, to solicit their reactions and input. The OECD RBC Center, of course, has received a lot of this input very directly and regularly from business at OECD. And since the formal adoption of the revised guidelines, business at OECD has been providing briefing updates to their member associations. And indeed, the member association I work most closely with, USCIB, has indeed invited the NCP to their last member meeting a few months ago. So the opportunity or the challenge, depending upon how you look at it, is several-fold. The first point is really about general awareness of the guidelines. I'm struck sometimes that there are numerous conferences and stakeholder groups and working committees that convene throughout the calendar year and throughout the globe that are focused on concepts such as RBC, CSR, ESG, human rights, environment, anti-corruption. And it's not often that the M&E guidelines are a significant part of some of those conferences. And I think that part of what would be very useful is working through OECD's institutional stakeholders, reaching out to maybe non-traditional kind of allies and supporters and conveners of RBC-like events to make sure that the updated M&E guidelines are part of kind of the ecosystem and the framework of how businesses are thinking about responsible business conduct. That does mean necessarily getting out of Paris and getting out of European capitals and traveling a bit, and whether it's taking better advantage of the NCPs where they are, or it's about the RBC Center or the institutional stakeholders doing that work. I think there's a huge opportunity to raise awareness of the M&E guidelines at existing events that are already about RBC. The second thing I'd like to talk about in terms of implementation is that, as we're all aware, there's a really dynamic regulatory environment that's been emerging over the last few years. A lot of legislation that is coming out in OECD member countries and others around human rights or environment or kind of CSR or supply chain due diligence. And I think one of the things that will be really important for business to understand is how these guidelines fit in the context of this broader ecosystem. So how will these guidelines maybe not necessarily become the legal regime, but how should business think about the guidelines as being complementary to or supportive of or helping to effectuate RBC in this broader ecosystem where companies are increasingly obligated to comply with legal obligations, right? So I think there needs to be kind of sort of a deeper understanding of those connection points. And just a sub point to that, companies don't necessarily get new resources when there's a new, regulation that's passed around due diligence or corporate sustainability reporting. So where there is a necessity to comply with new law, it's really going to be important to understand how these guidelines relate to that. The next thing I want to say is really around making the guidelines really practical. And I just want to reflect that companies don't tend to read 79-page narrative texts. That's not how we consume information. We use PowerPoints, we use process flows, we use checklists. So one of the things that I know business at OECD and its members will do, and we would welcome the RBC centers and other support on this, is how do we take this text and how do we translate it into tools that companies can use and that it is done in business language that makes it implementable. And that finally brings me to my last point, which is really just about making them practical. Companies, as I said, are increasingly focused on emerging legal compliance obligations with respect to RBC. And we'll have to make choices. We'll have to understand priorities and where the salient risks are. And so helping business to understand how to take practical action and what's actually feasible in the real life context and understanding that M&Es are all different and they've got different opportunities to affect change depending upon who they are and where they sit, that will be really important. So I think really thinking kind of with a business hat on and being really practical about how these can be brought to life will be a really important next step for all of us.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the business at the OECD perspective on that. And I think there are a number of things there that we would already from the Secretariat like to take you up on, such as how do we mainstream this in a reasonable way into the many discussions that, as you rightly point out, take place on related issues, but which are perhaps not quite joined up with our discussion here. And then, you know, how do we address the broader translation challenge? The guidelines themselves, as you, I think, said, are not necessarily like bedtime reading. So how do we translate? How do we make the messages practical and digestible? And I think you also really well framed the question that I think are on a lot of people's minds about how the whole ecosystem is going to develop. What is the role of the guidelines in driving this ecosystem in a aligned way that will be effective and at the same time not add unnecessary complexity. So I think that is a perfect segue, and I'd like to thank our three stakeholders for their contributions so far. And with that, I'd like to move us to our next panel, where we have invited some of the governments who have been part of negotiating this update. So I'll just introduce the panel briefly. We have Annika Konert, who is Policy Officer with the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action from Germany. We have Marcio Luis de Freitas Naves de Lima, who's Undersecretary for Foreign Investment and is also a coordinator of the National Contact Points for Responsible Business Conduct in Brazil, representing the government of Brazil. And last but not least, we have Terence Cowell, who is from Global Affairs Canada, representing Canada in our discussion. And I'd like to start, Annika, with you. Welcome to all three of you. I'd like to start, Annika, with you, and if you can talk us through from Germany's perspective, what are your current and upcoming plans for the implementation and dissemination of the updated guidelines? So that'll be my first question. Then I'll come back to you specifically also on consequences from as seen from the national contact point. Over to you, Annika.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks so much for inviting us and also for bringing us together to this webinar. I think this is really great to discuss the updated guidelines with representatives from other adherents, but also with our stakeholders. As Germany, we are of course very pleased that we all came together and were able to agree the update of the guidelines. In our view, the update was absolutely necessary to ensure that the guidelines continue to provide meaningful recommendations, including or in particular also on today's key challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, but also the digital transformation, to name just a few. With the update, the guidelines, we hope, can do their part in the transition towards a sustainable economy, but for that, of course, implementation is key. And I think like governments, national contact points, but also our stakeholders, we all have a role to play here. And as the German national contact point, we want to do our part. And I think that brings us now to the question you asked, Ellen. I think first we want to explain very clearly what the guidelines are about, what the update is about. We also want to do that for all the German speakers. So we commissioned a translation of the OECD guidelines into German, and it was just issued a few days ago. So for those German speakers out there, maybe have a look. It's available on the OECD website. We are also supporting the OECD Secretariat to translate or summarize this very technical, this very long document, and it has to be technical and long because there's a lot in there, but to translate it into plain language communication materials. And that goes a little bit to the point that Laura just mentioned. I think this is a very important point to really spread the word among everybody what the guidelines are really about and what the update really means. The second thing is we want to start a dialogue, or we have started a dialogue with the stakeholders here in Germany. Earlier this week on Tuesday, we had a big conference at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Berlin, where we launched the updated guidelines. We had the chair of the Working Party, Christine Kaufmann, with us, who gave a keynote about what the update actually entails. And then we had a very good discussion with our stakeholders, with business associations, civil society, trade unions, but also with 5 business representatives to really talk about what comes next, how can we implement the guidelines. And we want to continue this discussion next week at our environment ministry. We're going to have another big event with our stakeholders to unbox the environment chapter, one of the chapters, where there were really significant and very important changes to discuss how we can move forward with implementation there. And then we have a series of requests, but also presentations lined up for the end of the year, including presentations at universities. I think this is one of the key issues as well, to really bring the guidelines also to those that are becoming practitioners in the area of responsible business conduct. And then the third area is really talking or enabling implementation. And we are currently working on some very hands-on workshops for companies to help them with practical recommendations, best practice, and lessons learned to implement due diligence. And we are, of course, always happy to also continue discussions at the OECD level and with all stakeholders to see how we can better support the implementation of the updated guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. And I think based on what we heard from the stakeholders, there's definitely a lot of room also for collaboration, as you say, in terms of getting the message out, getting it translated, first of all, but also getting it into maybe more unfamiliar audiences than we have been able to do in the past. Thank you for that, Annika. I'll return to you in a little bit. Marcio, turning to you, thank you for joining. And from Brazil's perspective, what do you see as the current plans and upcoming priorities for implementing the updated guidelines? The floor is yours.
No. Thank you, Alan. It's very priority because today is Independence Day here in Brazil, and I'm here with you. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon for everyone. I think it's been great to be here with you. First of all, consider the change of government here and the fact that the Brazilian National Contact Point, it's an interministerial working group. We are making efforts to better leverage our interagency structure to ensure policy coherence. In this regard, we are working now on the dissemination of the policy expertise developed in the context of the Brazilian Responsible Business Conduct Action Plan that we call PASER, as well as to raise more awareness of the update guidelines in key parts of government. In this context, we are working with our interministerial working group on validating and updating the PASER to ensure alignment with the update guidelines, government policies, and proper implementation. This means that the new representatives of the interministerial working group have the important task of analyzing, editing, and validating the PASER, as well as promoting the implementation of a series of RBC projects in the most diverse subjects and sectors listed there. Furthermore, I think it's very important to inform that we finalized a strategic plan named Integrar, in English is Integrate, for the period of 2023 until 2026. The Integrar Action Plan is based on 3 pillars. The first one is promotion of responsible business conduct. The second one is treatment of specific instance. And the third and last one is RBC policy and practices. As we have different areas and sectors of the guidelines, the Integrar concept was proposed to, in addition to reflecting the idea of integrity and corporate responsibility in business, also refer to the idea of integrating multiple efforts, integrating values, and especially commercial and economic integration. In order to illustrate some of the action plan in which of the Integrar pillars, we can mention, for example, 1, we want to include the importance of the RBC during the Brazilian presidency of the G20. 2, preparing a joint events agenda between the ministers members of our interministerial work group for the coordinated promotion of RBC with various target audience, private sector, civil society, and so on. 30, elaborate by NCP Brazil of a handbook on the new OECD guidelines for better dissemination to stakeholders in our country. 4, promoting meetings with the private sector for discussion and training on new international standards of due diligence. 5, elaborate a new model of protocol or bilateral agreement of good practices in business with chapters related to the environmental, social issues, for example, human rights, work, include a specific chapter on gender balance, and chapters related to corporate governance and compliance that we call integrity corporate. Of course, taking into account the new OECD guidelines for multinational and other international standards. We are working, for example, on the implementation of new instruments which have better appeal and motivation for greater private sector engagement in RBC actions, such as the SIL Integral, and cooperation with business entities to promote the new guidelines. And finally, we are mapping stakeholders for dissemination promotion of the OECD guidelines, whether through events, sharing of promotional material, or providing direct assistance. And finally, we're going to launch together with you, with the OECD, the Portuguese version of the new guidelines. So in this context, these are the sum of our plans for implementation, dissemination of update guidelines, as well as to ensure policy coherence. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Marcio, and happy Independence Day, and thank you for joining nonetheless on your day off. I think you gave a really good, example of not only the important role of government in dissemination, awareness raising, but also on the side of the policy coherence inside the government through the coordination mechanism you have, through the action plan PASER, as you mentioned, and now with the integrate plan, and also where you are capable of leveraging the G20 presidency to promote RBC at a multilateral level is really important. Thank you, Marcio. Terry, let me go to you next from Global Affairs Canada. From your perspective, how do you see the current and upcoming plans from Canada to implement and disseminate what we now have in front of us? Over to you.
Thanks, Alan. It's a pleasure to join today's panel, and it's also great to join my colleagues Marcio and Annika, and happy Independence Day, Marcio. I'm glad you're with us. For us, we really see as part of Canada's foreign ministry, we welcome the updates to the OECD guidelines. Because we don't just see the guidelines as an important set of guidance and inspiration for our Canadian companies abroad, but it's really a foundational text informing the implementation of Canada's RBC strategy and of course our NCP. And so, given that, it was really vital for us that the guidelines remain fit for purpose and relevant to today's context. So amongst other things, we really thought it was valuable. We saw some of the key issues for RBC: climate, the rights of Indigenous peoples, the responsible use of new and emerging technologies. That these are now better reflected in the guidelines. And so, we also see now the updates as a real springboard for us to enhance our engagement and promotion of the guidelines, particularly the new updates. In terms of our outreach efforts, we really see a variety of efforts. More generally, we talk to a range of stakeholders about RBC abroad, and then of course, the OECD guidelines are a key part of those that general outreach. We combine this with organizing sector-specific events, particularly on the guidelines and related OECD due diligence tools. So, for example, we're actually working with the OECD Secretariat on a garment-focused event next month. And so we see that as a great opportunity to promote the new updates. And I think for us, we've also pivoted where we are spending more effort on new and emerging sectors. So, for example, technology and science sectors. And so for us, it's been really important to familiarize these enterprises with the updates to the new chapter on science, tech, and innovation. For Canada, I think a lot of countries, our exporters, our countries that are companies that are active overseas, are small to medium-sized enterprises. And so it's important for us to enhance a lot of outreach with SMEs. So, for example, I'll be presenting at the APEC Business Ethics for SMEs Forum later this month in Washington, D.C. And that event will have a particular focus in the life sciences sector. And so I'll be looking forward to promoting the guidelines. And I'd say, beyond our engagement with our stakeholders, it's also to be important that we're engaging within the government. So, for example, I mentioned I'm part of the Trade Commissioner Service. We have 1,000 trade commissioners based overseas and 160 missions, supporting Canadian companies. And so it's important for us to educate our trade commissioners about the updated guidelines so they can help provide that best possible advice to these Canadian enterprises that are operating outside of Canada. And in fact, we've established an RBC Champions Network of Canadian missions to help leverage their experience in this issue and help provide that guidance to other missions for whom this is maybe a relatively new area. And then, of course, within our colleagues within the federal government, provincial and territorial governments as well, we've organized a number of initiatives to help promote the guidelines and again to help inform our companies along there. I think the last thing I'll say, Alan, is starting in 2022 as part of our RBC strategy, we launched the development of a new national standard on RBC due diligence. And once completed, we expect this to be wrapped up in 2024. We expect this standard to be a roadmap to help Canadian companies, particularly SMEs, understand, implement, and report on RBC due diligence. And these are particularly in line with applicable standards, in particular, the OECD updated OECD guidelines. So that's just a flavor of some of the activities we'll be undertaking. Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. And you mentioned a lot of things there. I'll just pick up on the point you made about small and medium-sized enterprises being multinational in their own right, but also being increasingly confronted with these types of questions and standards from business partners, regulators in different contexts. So I think you highlight there a key point and a challenge also for all of us going forward. And I know that was also a key discussion when we did the update of the guidelines as a priority area that needs more attention going forward. We don't have a lot of time, but I would like to circle back to each of you for just 1 minute on what your NCP will do differently because of the updated procedures. So that's obviously a very specific area where governments have a strong commitment as per the decision on the guidelines. Now we have the updated procedures in front of us, knowing that NCPs are different and operate in different circumstances. What do you see your NCP doing differently because of this update going forward? Maybe, Annika, I can start with you again, and then we take it from there, just maybe 1 minute. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think one of the key issues that was included in the update is the periodic peer review. And I think this is really a very important development to really help us to continuously learn from each other as NCPs, but also really continue to improve our national contact points. There were several changes. Catherine outlined them also in how we handle our complaints cases. And we here in Germany at the German NCP, we took that as an opportunity to look very closely at our national contact point to see how well are we aligned with the updated procedures and where is there perhaps room for even better alignment now that the update is out there. I think we identified a good amount of gaps and areas for improvement, and we are currently working on a first draft of updated rules of procedure, which we're going to share with our stakeholders from the various ministries, but also, of course, our stakeholders in the advisory committee, bringing together business associations, trade unions, civil society, and experts to discuss them. And I think this will be one of our key projects for the fall. And hopefully we're going to have updated rules of procedure in Germany by the end of the year. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. And I know all NCPs will have to go through the same process now, so I'm sure you will have lots of interest from others in what you're doing. Marcio, from your perspective from the NCP of Brazil, what do you see as the major changes going forward?
Oh, thank you, Alan. Now, as we know, the newly updated procedures detail the NCP's function associated with institutional arrangements, formation, promotion, specific instance support for government efforts to promote responsible business conduct, reporting, and peer reviews. The Integra sought to include in this pillar the actions necessary to achieve the objectives proposed in the update procedures. In order to exemplify, I think it's important mentioning, for example, our experience with the Brazilian peer review report. We may say that it helped us to prioritize what was the most important issues to improve concerning the institutional arrangements, promotion activities, and the specific instance process. This report was essential for the integrated elaboration. Regarding to institutional arrangements, as we said, we are working on an agenda for joint events of the Interministerial Work Group to promote RBC with various target audience, private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders, as well as in the creation of a multi-sectorial advisory group composed of members of the private sector, trade unions, academy, civil society, among others, to help improve and monitor the work of the NCP Brazil, especially with regard to specific instance. Concerning the promotion activities, as mentioned, the NCP Brazil intends to do a stakeholder mapping and identify multiplayer organizations with broad networks and geographic reach, as well as to raise more awareness of the updated guidelines in key parts of government and advance on the validating and updating of the PASER to ensure alignment with government policies and proper implementation. In addition, we mean to increase the electronic dissemination of the NSP among other actions. Regarding the specific instance, the Integra includes actions as the review of our rules of procedure in line with the update procedures, includes proposal to improve the specific instance process by the development of a computerized systems of a specific instance and the creation of a reference list of mediators pro bono to act in the specific instance here in our NSP. As you can see, the NSP Brazil have a lot of actions under our Integra to implementation and dissemination of the update guidelines. And for line, of course, our NSP with the new update procedures. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Marcio. A host of, I think, very, very concrete actions here that will really, I think, move the needle even more also for RBC in Brazil, in addition to everything that was already going on. And you specifically mentioned the value of the peer review, and the important message there, of course, is that these peer reviews are now periodic and mandatory for all the NCPs going forward, and has really proven to be a key vehicle for ensuring and enhancing functional equivalence. Terry, you touched on it a little bit with the RBC strategy, and obviously the NCP's central role in all of that. Maybe you could highlight a few of the more concrete changes that you see because of the new procedures for the Canadian NCP. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alan. As it happens, just about a year ago in September of 2022, we updated our procedures for our NCP, and this followed a process of consultations with external stakeholders, including civil society, and of course that was informed. And Annika mentioned peer reviews. That was informed by the 2019 peer review that the OECD led of Canada's NCP. So a couple of highlights there. Now that Canada, since the new procedures, we now publish initial assessments for future cases. We've also implemented a case tracker so the public can track these cases as they evolve. And we're one of the few NCPs that actually have consequences for companies that don't engage in good faith with an NCP procedure. So we've actually enhanced that procedure. So if a company does not engage in good faith with Canada's NCP, we can recommend the withdrawal of all trade support from the Trade Commissioner's Service. I'd also recommend to our export credit agency to deny all future support to these companies. So so these we felt already in line with the new procedures. But that being said, there are some tweaks that we'll be undertaking later this fall, just to make sure that they are reflective of the latest updates. I think particular what we really took note of, and I thought was quite helpful, was the emphasis on enhanced stakeholder engagement. So we'll be looking at how we could further our steps in engaging with a wide range of stakeholders to promote the guidelines, and in particular the NCP. So thanks, Alan.
Thanks a lot, Terry, and I think you also outlined some of the unique features of the Canadian NCP that I know will also be looked at with interest by other NCPs, such as the consequences and what you're doing with the case tracker. So I think we've been through 2 panels now, Catherine, with which I think demonstrate how the update will move the needle, but also the combined reach of our stakeholders and our governments in terms of driving implementation and some of the very concrete, but also very long-term actions, and perhaps also some areas that need our further attention from the OECD, such as really getting the guidelines positioned in mainstream RBC and ESG discussions going forward in a better way. I've also been watching the chats, and I know you have been too, so maybe we can turn to some of the questions that have come in, Catherine.
Great, thanks very much, Alan, and many thanks to all of our panelists for really bringing to life what happens now with these new updated guidelines. We did indeed get a number of questions and comments in the chat, and thank you to everybody who put those forward. We won't have time to address all of them right now, but I wanted to pick off a few and give some responses to them. So an important question was actually raised around when do these new guidelines apply? And it's a question that we get quite a lot. And it's an interesting one because, you know, unlike other instruments, it doesn't really have a sort of entry into force process, but the guidelines have been with us publicly since the 8th of June, and that's when they became the latest version of the guidelines and overtook the 2011 version. The question raised also, what does this mean for cases going before national contact points, which is a very interesting one. And that will be looked at, of course, by NCPs on a case-by-case basis, mainly looking at when the conduct that underlines the case may have occurred. There was also a question with regards to the language of value chains. Now, that term doesn't appear in the updated version of the guidelines. We use the term supply chains, but we mean end-to-end supply chains. And that's important to note. And you'll see that when you read the definition of business relationships and how sort of broad that is. So hopefully that covers that one off. There was a question with regards to limited companies and whether they're covered. Normally with a multinational aspect, they would be. You would take a look at the language that's in the guidelines in that respect. And then there was a question with regards how the guidelines relate to other kind of international law and regulation, domestic laws, etc. So maybe here, just to reiterate that we often speak about sort of the triangle of the OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the ILO declaration as really all sort of being complementary with one another and aligned with one another. It's important to note. With regards to developments at the local and international law, our guidelines may well inspire developments, but of course they're soft law, they remain soft law, so they're a different process in that sense. And there was a point raised with regards to the SDGs, Alan just mentioned them. In closing, they're relevant, of course, as an international framework in this space. And so we can just underscore that we weren't leaving them out by any means. There's a lot to talk about in relation to this topic. We won't have time, unfortunately, to hand back questions to individual panelists at this stage, and we've tried our best to address a number of them there. So I hope that's sufficient, because I do want to use the last few minutes that we have together to hand the floor over to our chair of the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct, Christine Kaufmann, who will give us some of her closing reflections based on what she's heard today. Christine.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all for a very rich afternoon. As you know, we had a first webinar this morning, and it's striking to see, how much there is to say and also how different the discussion was this afternoon. I want to highlight a few points that I think are very important to keep in mind, and also share some ideas on the way forward with you. My first observation and point that I would like to recall is really that the updated guidelines, their reach goes way beyond the 51 adhering countries that we have at the moment. And the purpose of the guidelines, and many of you alluded to that, is really to benefit people in all countries. And there was a question in the chat about what's the relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is essentially the key theme. What do we want to achieve? We want to contribute to a sustainable, responsible, inclusive economy. So we're fully in line with the SDGs. Now, what does that take in order to get there? It really takes, and this was very important for the adhering countries when we started the process, we need to address the big challenges. We must not be shy to ask the big questions. And the key challenges that we are facing today are really, some of them were mentioned already. It's climate change, the threat of biodiversity, it's the digital transition, it's also the impact of the war of aggression against Ukraine. So lots of issues that we need to discuss when we look at the effect that this has on global supply chains. So in other words, we really try to keep the eyes on the horizon, on the big picture, while discussing the update. At the same time, and I think Biak made a very strong point on that, as well as the representative from the Center for Business and Human, the Resource Center for Business and Human Rights, we also need to make sure we're operational, we're practical, we really have an impact on real people's real life. So keep the feet on the ground. And this is what I would say is one of the beauties of the guidelines, of the updated guidelines, that we do address the big challenges, but we also ensure that we can address them in a manageable way. And what does that mean? It really means that we stick to established concepts that worked in the past. And we heard from business at OECD how much businesses at OECD has been engaged, how much companies have been engaged in implementing the guidelines for decades now. And we kept the DNA, I would call it the DNA of the guidelines, really. It's the concept of risk-based due diligence that comes with flexibility, that comes with proportionality, that comes with the possibility of prioritizing. That remains unchanged. What has changed is that we elaborate on what does that mean in the context of these new challenges. It was mentioned how many pages business especially has to digest now with the new provisions on the environment chapter, on the tech chapter. Clearly, if there are questions out there, we need answers. And we really tried in the negotiations to include as many answers. What does due diligence mean in these new challenges in the guidelines? Obviously, you cannot, in the guidelines, you cannot give all the answers, otherwise we would have 500 pages probably of text. But we really wanted to make sure that we remain fit for the future, also with a certain flexibility and openness. What we did not change at all is also the holistic approach that the guidelines have been applying for a decade now. We look at all the risks, no exception, for people and the planet. And we now elaborate not only on what that means for due diligence, but we also elaborate what does it mean for vulnerable people, groups at risk, what does it mean for indigenous people. And this is very, very important, and I would strongly encourage you, Catherine alluded to that in her presentation, we have some hidden jewels in the updated guidelines. They're not obvious, they're kind of hiding somewhere in the general chapters on general policies. So look at them, look at what the guidelines now say on lobbying, on reprisals, on corruption. It's part of a whole package. And again, it's part of the DNA to look at all the risks, to look at the whole supply chain, and just make sure that we can effectively implement the text. Now, what does effectively implementing mean? It does for sure not mean more paper and more reports. It really means we want to ensure that we have a real impact in the real life of real people. And that means in practice, we can only implement what we know. So raising awareness is key, and I'm very happy to see that everybody speaking today mentioned that. And we also saw that some governments, the stakeholders, really, they provide excellent examples on how this can be done. So it's an issue for governments, it's an issue for business, it's an issue for NCPs, and we need more mainstreaming. That also means translating the guidelines, the idea of the guidelines into the language of the respective stakeholders, be it business, be it governments. And we heard from the representatives also from governments that it's not always that easy to communicate the idea, even within the government, across different ministries, across different departments. Mainstreaming can also mean that you leverage your role as the chair of an international, of an intergovernmental body. We heard from Brazil about the plans to leverage the presidency of the G20. We have the example already of Germany presiding the G7 in the past, and really using this for mainstreaming RBC at a very large scale. So to put it simple, we all need to lead by example. We need governments acting and leading by example. We also need business leading by example. And I would really call also on business associations. I know how tricky it can be as a business association, because you have, of course, to represent all the interests of all your members. But now that we're done with the negotiations, that we have a result, it would really help the implementation to bring in more voices of companies that are already leading in this regard. So this will, I think, essentially then and eventually help us in really moving the needle. I should also mention that the OECD will do its part. It was mentioned the special position and the challenges for SMEs. We're fully aware of that. It was a current theme throughout the negotiations, but we also realized we don't have all the answers. There's really more that needs to be done. And this will be one of the topics where we need more work. Another one is, it was also mentioned by the representative from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, it was also mentioned this morning, is indigenous people and groups at risk, where we also need more thinking, we need more discussions with all the stakeholders on what exactly does that mean, how can we effectively protect these groups. And then needless to say, and here I'm coming back to business at OECD, we did a lot of work thanks to all the discussions with all the stakeholders and the governments on environment and climate change, but we still need more translation tools, I would call it. So there's more work, not necessarily more paper, for sure not more standards or even new standards, but more practical guidance on how to implement. And the last point really that some of you mentioned a little bit in brackets is really how to reach out. And it was mentioned very clearly, again, by business at OECD, but also by the representative from trade unions. We need to get out of Paris, and we need to get out not only of Paris, we also need to get out beyond the 51 adherence at the moment. So what we would like to see is this risk-based approach of due diligence being applied in global markets, really across the globe. So there's more outreach activities that are being planned, and we will, of course, get back to you, all the stakeholders, on these very important issues. I'm very optimistic that it can be done. I think we have an excellent basis now with the updated guidelines. So all we need to do is really swing into action. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Christine, for those closing words. That's really wonderful and very helpful. Good. Then in the last minute that we have together, I'm just very happy to thank all of our attendees for joining us for this session. It was wonderful to have you here, and thank you for your comments and your questions during the event. And of course, very heartfelt thanks to all of the speakers who joined us for sharing their thoughts and visions on what looks like a very exciting journey ahead for our updated guidelines. I'd also like to flag that we have a couple more webinars in the pipeline as part of this series. So on the 5th of October, we'll be doing one dedicated to the tech chapter. And on the 19th of October, we will have one all about the environment chapter, and in particular with a focus on climate change. So you'll see more details about those on our website and on social media, so look out for that and feel free to promote them to your constituents. But for now, enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.